Howdy, everybody. So I was going to have Jojo Roper here, but we had to push him out another week. But I've got some questions. Some pretty good ones this week. Any new designs coming down the pipeline? Coming forward. We've got quite a few actually. We've got an egg, a modified modern egg that is available stringless with rail grab channels as a forefin or as a 2+1, and Huntington Surfboard has put in a healthy order for those, and hopefully they'll have them in the store at the end of July. There's a lot of interest in mid-length boards these days, and a lot of people haven't ever really ridden an egg. They're fun boards. They're pretty versatile, but they're primarily for just kind of cruising in small to medium-sized surf. And I've been making them all along. I made some in the early '70s, along Skip Fry at GNS, and used to go surfing with him occasionally. I had him shape me some eggs. My eggs, the modern version is going to have a little bit more rocker. It'll have a fairly flat bottom through the center, with I call medium depth double barrel into a single V off the tail, and it'll have a more crown deck, a little bit thinner rails, and like I said, they're available with or without the rail grooves. Thoughts? Let me see. Bottom contour depth. How deep from the highest point do you make a V, a double single concave? It's a good question. I'm not sure if we're going to answer it specifically, but to me, the control center of the board is between your feet, tending towards your back foot, and that zone just behind center is where I usually put the deepest V, which is the V's I put a little bit closer to the fins, the concaves I move up slightly. But my experience over the years, and I've done some deep concaves and some deep V's, is 3/8 of an inch is a pretty big number, 375. I tend to try and stop at about 0.3 in terms of depth. So the center, on a deep concave, the center might be 0.15 to 0.2, and then it'll get deeper to in between the feet, possibly 0.28 or 3 in some cases, and the same with the V's. And the reason for that is when, like with a V, it starts to create too much drag. The board becomes tippy, and it lays over on a rail, and it wants to drive on a rail. But something a little bit shallower still creates a good rail-to-rail looseness, finds the rail, and doesn't have as much drag as, say, something like 3/8 of an inch. I actually don't think I've ever made a V or concave a ½ inch deep. The same thing with concaves. A few years ago, with this company up in Newport Beach, they made hollow carbon surfboards, and we were playing with double barrel V's all the way up through the board. And do you remember when that was, Pedro? With
Was the hollow boards or what?
Yeah, the hollow boards.
The black ones, cardboard?
Yeah,
No.
yeah.
Yeah.
Aviso. Aviso.
Yeah.
That was at least 15 years ago.
Yeah, about that.
Maybe 20 years ago. And people kind of liked that full nose to tail double barrel V. But I really haven't had much call for it since. And so, I mean, the typical bottom that I make is kind of flattish under the nose, a slight concave in the center that feeds into a double barrel between the feet and into a single barrel with a slight crown off the edge of the tail. And that's a bottom that I use on a lot of the models. And some models are shallower than others, and some are deeper. From Piran 23, I'm 5'9". What length should my fish be? Well, do you weigh 150 or do you weigh 250? And that's when you go online and you order a custom board. I think the very first thing a shaper wants to know is how much you weigh. Age comes into it, because if you're young and bigger, you can ride a smaller board. If you're older, and older is a relative term, but the boards start to creep up in size. But really it's your weight is the single determinant. I can't say that weight is the biggest factor in designing a custom board. I need to know the age and the height of the person as well, and your experience. And pretty much everybody out there says they're intermediate advanced. And all right, I'll take your word for that. But to be truthful, I get a lot of beginning surfers that want their first short board. They make a big jump off a 9-foot softboard and they want a 6.0 SD or something like that, and I try and calm them down. But as far as your question goes, the fishes are typically under 6 feet long, between 5'5" and 6 feet long, but I make them bigger and smaller. But if you give me your weight, I can probably give you a more accurate answer. What about putting small fin on the back of twin fins? That's the third fin. I call that a trifin. A twin fin has 2 fins. And if they're designed properly, they'll work in almost any size surf. I think the third fin is a safety net for the consumer. They feel if they can't figure it out as a twin fin, maybe they can ride it as maybe a smaller back fin tri-fin. And I have my thoughts on that. I think if the fin's just too small, you're actually pushing it through the water, and it creates drag more than thrust or hold. Reasons against putting a hard edge on the entire length of my mini Simmons rails. Anything works. You could have completely squared down rails with a hard edge, and the board will work, but it'll have limitations. I think rail flow is like every component of design is extremely important. I have a firm edge, not hard, but a firm edge up front, and then it goes into the softest part of the rail, which I believe should coincide with the wide point. And I've made boards with rails that are a little bit softer and fuller behind the wide point, and they work okay. They go rail to rail okay, but they don't sustain the drive out of the turn. You come out of a turn and the board slows down rather quickly. So it's a fine balance. With the custom boards, the zone in the fin area, like it used to be 4 fingers in front of the leading edge of the fin is where the edge starts. And over time, it's varied a little bit, but that's generally where the hard rail starts. And it's some people like a more easier transition. Some people like a quicker transition, and most people prefer a hard edge in the last 10 to 12 inches. But a hard edge all the way up, I think the board will skate. It'll want to stay on top of the water, and it'll resist more going into the water unless you have a really low volume rail. And in my experience, the biggest issue with rails that are too hard up front is they fight back and they catch. And but if you want to get a board with a hard edge all the way up, try it. You might like it. Okay.
Channels or no channels on the blade?
Yeah.
What's your preference?
Well, it's the channel bottoms have a shallower feed concave, and the channels off the tail give the board a little bit more drive, a little bit more direction down the line. They tend to add a little bit more grab. The concave, the board will probably feel a little bit more alive, twitchier, shorter arcs, and I'm getting orders about half and half, maybe a little bit more towards 4 channels, because a lot of people haven't ever had channel bottoms, and these are, I would say, pretty benign channels. They're not, they're kind of moderately deep, and there's 4 of them, which ties into another question here I have. What kind of wave do you recommend having channels on a surfboard? All kinds of channels. Originally they started as, I believe, they started as 6 deep channels in the mid-70s, Cole Smith. And they made their way around the world, and by the late 70s, I had quite a few channel bottoms, and I think they really helped the single fins have drive, give them direction and drive and holding power. On tri-fins, we had originally 6 deep channels and 4 deep channels, and then belly channels. Belly channels are shallow channels between the fins and the wide point. They're very shallow, and they're designed just to break up the bottom and free up the board a little bit from rail to rail, but adding a little bit of drive. The boards with the heavier channels, like the 6 deep channels, I found that they work great in clean surface waves. They're kind of a favorite go-to bottom for Indo in the early days, and like I said, I've made a lot, and I used to really like them out at a spot like Cloudbreak, where the way it's powerful, it's lined up, and I remember the first bottom turn I did on a 6 deep channel, and it kind of freaked me out. I went and laid over, and it didn't come up the face the same arc that most of my other boards did. It laid over, and it came up the face more slowly, but it had so much more thrust and speed out of a turn than I'd ever gotten before. and so I started putting them on almost everything. And I found that when the surface becomes an issue, the channels become an issue. So if you get the surf clean, lined up hollow waves, 6 deep channels are a pretty good go-to. The 4 channels, as I said before, off the blade are more moderate depth, and they feed off the tail, and they just give kind of a more secure feeling in a turn, a little bit more drive. Does Rusty have any gun models? Yeah, I used to. I've been fascinated by big wave boards since the late '60s, and I've made thousands and thousands of guns for some of the best surfers in the world, and but over time, I've got the Blackbird, which is kind of intended as a step up, but I basically do mostly custom guns, but they don't vary much, really. I don't like the wide point too far forward, a couple 3 inches maybe. I don't like the tails too narrow. I think forefins are great. I think with a gun you need a little bit of not V in the center, but you need break from rail to rail. It doesn't quite come to a spine in the middle, but and a little bit more break up front, and then a little bit deeper V in back. But like I said before, for me, a 1/4 inch to 0.3 is about as deep as I go on the V's. And with the guns, you're usually riding bigger waves, and you rarely have glassy days. You usually have some kind of wind, and the board's so long. It's just having a whole convex bottom helps penetrate the wave a little bit better, and it enhances the ability to get the board over on rail more. And as far as the tail width, in many years the tails, I think, were too narrow. And in the early 80s, I went to Hawaii every winter for almost 50 years, but I used to stay with Pat Rawson, and I tripped because he was kind of the go-to guy in the early 80s. And he had a high percentage of his guns had swallowtails. They're 3 to 4 inches wide, pretty shallow, but it made me think, because one of the boards in my collection is a Preisendorfer gun, a 12-foot gun, and it comes back into, believe it or not, like a 3-inch square tail. And I think if the tail's too narrow, it's going to sit too deep in the water and cause too much drag. So yeah, there's a very fine line on tail widths. Nose widths vary a little bit more. And entry rocker, I would guess that my entry rocker, my tail rockers are probably comparable to most. My entry rocker is a little bit lower, and that's because if you're riding a board, say a true gun like a 9-footer, 9/6, 10-footer, you have a long sloping face, and you don't need 8 inches of nose rocker. You probably don't need 7.5, and maybe 7 or 6 3/4 is the bottom line. But I think the board gets in you catch the wave a little bit earlier. You don't have any issues with hanging up because you're not really surfing in tight curves anymore. The curves are all expanded. So yeah, I make a lot of custom guns, I'll put it that way. Any other questions? Let me see. what fins would you recommend I use for my 6'6" heckler? I'm a big guy, 6'3", 225 pounds, intermediate advanced skill, small to medium San Diego surf. Bigger, the average fin is like 4.5 deep, maybe 4 5/8, 4.6, 4.65 is starting to get deeper. But I think a guy that's over 200 pounds would like and need a fin about 4.7, 4.75 with an appropriate base too. The reason is being a heavier surfer, riding a bit more board. If your fins are too small, you're going to push them through the water. And there's I've had a lot of boards, and I've had a lot of friends get boards that they ride fins that aren't enough area, and once again the fin thing is, any kind of template works, does something, but in my experience, and I used to be a fin junkie. My son used to accuse me of using the F word too often. But the shape, the rake, the base, the fin, pretty much across the board, everybody's on the same page. So, a bigger guy needs more fin than 4.5 inches. That's 4.7, 4.75 is probably a good call. What's the difference between a quad and a 20, and what ways should you surf them on? For the last 20 years, all I rode was quads with an occasional twin. Very rare. I made quads in the early 80s for some surfers like Glenn Winton from Australia and a few other guys, and they kind of went by the wayside. But around 2004, 2005, one of my team riders from North County was friends with Nathan Fletcher, and he tried some of Nathan's stretch quads, and he was freaking on them. And so I made my team rider some, and he loved them, and so I made myself some. And honestly, it opened new doors for me. It would drop in the face easier. It would draw out the turns better. I swear the first cutback I did on a 4-fin was mind-blowing because I went out on the shoulder, and the tri-fin, unless everything's going perfectly, you start, it's almost like a slowing down maneuver. But with the quad, it I held the board on rail, and it came around the corner with the same speed and almost more as I completed the turn and headed back towards the braking part of the wave. And I think twin fins are great. I said you can ride them in any size surf, any size surf. But twins are. There's no reason not to ride a well-designed twin fin, maybe a stretched-out twin fin in double overhead surf, maybe even triple. But I think once you start getting into double overhead stuff, the 4 fins, the 2 rear fins, give you a little bit of extra security in terms of hold and a more determined drive. A lot of my friends I talk into putting 5 fin boxes in. It's not so much to have them available as a twin fin, because I think a proper twin fin, the fins are back 2.5, 3 inches further back than they are on a tri or a quad. But so they can try the board as a tri fin, which they're used to, and they're balking on a quad. And 6 months later, I said, "Well, how's the board work?" And they go, "It works good. It works good." And I go, "Have you tried it as a quad yet?" And they go, "Oh, well, no." I said, You got 5 fins and you got the board. So take the center fin out, put the 2 rears in, and try the board." And a week later, they get back to me and they go, "My God, it's a new board." So yeah, I think, twins are a go-to in smaller surf, and quads are a go-to in bigger surf. You've made a few boards not recently. I don't make many. There's guys that make wood boards full time, but I've made them over the years. And the question is, compared to a regular PU surfboard, how long does one of those take to make, and what's the difference between them both, pros and cons? In terms of shaping, it might take me an hour and a half to hand shape a board. Let's say apples to apples, and it's a gun. It's a 10-foot gun. If I shape a PU gun with a big stringer, maybe hand shape takes 2.5 hours, 3 the most. A wood board, 20 hours. Seriously, it takes almost 10 times as long. Maybe that's because I don't do as many as some guys, but there is a lot of work that goes into the wood guns. The solid wood guns, I don't think many people ride them. People do, but they're very heavy. The chambered boards, whether it's balsa or a balsa redwood combination, those get ridden more, and they tend to get ridden in much, much bigger surf where the weight comes in handy. And there's a lot more work that's involved in the wood boards, especially the solid wood boards. And I find the solid wood boards, I mean, they're both aesthetically, they're beautiful, whether they're chambered or solid, but the solid ones, they're special, and I think most people end up hanging them in their house or maybe riding them a couple times, but they're more of a showpiece, and legitimately so, of craftsmanship. And the glassing, it definitely takes longer to glass a wood board because you have to do several layers of sealant, resin. You have to put resin coats on the bare wood, several coats, and there's a lot more steps involved in glassing a solid wood board. And so if you can find a solid wood board out there for less than $2,000, you got a deal, I think. Next question. What is your proudest moment with regards to performance and achievements of your team surfers over the years? My proudest moment with regards to the performance and achievements of your team? There's been, I couldn't pin it on any one rider. I've had so many great surfers on my boards for the last 45 years. The first great surfer to get a board off of me was Rabbit in spring of '74. I was in Australia, and he was coveting my 8-foot gun, and so when I left, I sold it to him. That's a good story. Aki, the first board I made him, is a good story because I saw him surfing in the Hang 10 Grand Prix at Ocean Beach in June or May in '83, and I think he was just 16, and he was riding for Jim Banks at the time, and I could see the kid was gifted. He was a truly gifted surfer, but he was having problems with his boards catching rails and not having a lot of flow. And so I was very busy at that time shaping, but I was also very busy judging, and I happened to be judging the contests. And I judged a lot of ASP contests and a lot of like Hang 10 or Body Glow Grand Prix. I was pretty busy judging from '79 to '84, I think. And so I made Aki a board to take to South Africa, but I never hooked up with him. And he goes to South Africa, and I'm not sure if I'm right, but I think that's the year that he beat Sean Thompson. And that's like beating the absolute legend at J Bay, and you're a 16-year-old kid. So there's all this buzz about him. He came back and he had to surf in the OP Pro. And, he called me and he said, thanks. I'm going to hold off writing the board because it's different. I'm not sure how it's going to go, but I'll write it in Australia and I'll get back to you. So he surfs in the OP Pro, and then he goes and he does the Pro Junior in Australia, which is a pretty prestigious contest, and he won it on the board I made him. So that was the first major contest win I've had, and he took the board to Japan for the Muri Pro, and I told the story dozens of times. He broke he broke about 8 inches off the nose of his 6'1", I think it was. About 8 inches off the nose of his board, but he loved it so much he kept riding it, and I think he got to the semifinals. He just missed getting in the finals. And Bob Hurley, who was running Billabong at the time, Billabong USA, called me and he says, "Can I get a couple more boards for Aki?" Aki winning his first major contest on one of my boards was a pretty proud moment. And CJ winning the world title. I was in Fiji, and I was agonizing because he was still in the contest, but he was in 8th place, and it was at sunset. And I was, agonizing on getting on a plane and flying to Hawaii it was the last day of the contest, and I said, "There's no way he's gonna win the world title." And so I went to bed that night, and I got up the next morning, and a couple of boatmen said, "Hey man, congratulations." And I go, "What?" And he goes, "CJ won the world title." Both you guys, CJ, Damien, love you guys. And so many other great team riders over the years. So I can't put the proudest moment on any one single person, but if you push me, I'd have to say it was Aki. Aki, I still love the way he surfs. What else? You got any more for me? Well, foil surfboards. What do you think of these? And have you ever shaped a foil board? I'm intrigued by them. I've never ridden one, but as they've evolved, I think they're a legitimate part of a surfer's quiver: skateboard, snowboard, foil board. And I've been asked to shape a few, but to be quite honest, I'm not exactly sure how they work or why they work, but I do respect the level that some of these foil boards have taken their foil craft to. What else? Got any other questions, Pedro?
No, not
what?
No.
What's your favorite? What's Tevro? Okay, buoyancy discussion. This is a big one. What's the difference between EPS, epoxy, and PU? Volume calculators are fine, but I'm talking buoyancy. I run 1.5 to 2 liters on shortboards and 2 to 4 on longboards. So if a customer rides PU and he wants an epoxy, I drop the volume by 1.5 to 2 liters, and vice versa. I think I touched on this last week a little bit, but generally speaking, first you have to talk about the 2 or 3 different kinds of cores, but the main cores that we use are polyurethane and EPS. The EPS is just a much lighter foam. For those of you that don't know, the EPS starts out as very small, hard beads, and then it gets put into a mold, whether it's a a big square mold, and they hot wire the profiles out of them, or there's actually molds that resemble a little bit bigger surfboard. And I think those are the way to go, is the molded EPS, because you get a tighter fuse, and tighter fuse means it's more waterproof. But generally speaking, those EPS blanks are at least 10% lighter, maybe 15%. And then you can glass polyurethane with polyester resin. You can glass it with epoxy resin, and that's what we call the E-poly. The epoxy resin comes out a touch lighter than the polyester resin. It's got better flex. It maintains its flex better. It's in the modern, I mean the last 5 or 10 years, epoxies have evolved into very white, bright, clear resins. So PU, you can glass with either resin, but it's the heaviest core, the EPS. It, after it's shaped, is maybe 15% lighter. After it's glassed, it soaks up a little bit more resin, but it still ends up being 8 to 10% lighter. The torsion springs, the blank is a little bit denser, but it's still pretty light, and that ends up being 5 to 7% lighter. And I think the key thing that you talk about is the volume calculators. I think that is the greatest double-edged sword that the surf industry has seen in a long time, because there's so many people that have volume calculators. You can buy it and outright, or if you want one through your website, there's a guy you can go to and you can pay monthly or buy it outright. And when my first experience with a volume calculator, I used to talk to Gordon Clark about the volume of a blank, and he goes, I go, how do you get it? He goes, we have a tank we submerge it in, and it's basically displacement. And then when I first started shaping by computer almost 20 years ago, I had my software, but there was other software coming out, and my software, I think, measured in liters, and I didn't really pay any attention to it the first couple of years. And the designer said, you should pay attention to volume, it's very important. And a couple of the other software designers, one of them was using beers as a volume gauge. Beers, I don't know, it depends on the size beer you have, but a beer is anywhere from a half a liter to a liter. But he would say, well, this board's 30 beers or something like that. But over the years, everybody has become so fixated on, and I'm gonna fucking talk about this every week because it drives me crazy, because I get customers. And all right, so you really are an advanced surfer, all right? I'll give you a liter. I'll give you the fact that you can feel a liter on a short board. A half a liter? Say the difference between 26 and 25.5. If you're maybe one of the top pros in the world, you can maybe feel the difference in a half liter. I used to, occasionally I had team riders in the 80s. Mitch Thorson was one, and he was another butt board guy. He goes, wow, I really like that board butt. And so I finally had enough of his butt shit, and he told me the dimensions, how he wanted to change the board, and I listened to him and I shook my head. All right, I got it. And I shaped the board the way I thought it should be shaped, but I wrote his numbers on the stringer. He loved the board. So a lot of it, back to the volume calculators, a lot of it's in your mind. Yes, if you're an average surfer and you're riding a shorter board, yeah, you have your volume range, maybe a liter and a half, 2 liters on, liter on either side of a number. A bigger board, I don't, boards up around 50, 60, 70 liters. You shouldn't really worry about liters unless it's a percentage. So it's the short boards, half a liter. You take that percentage and you translate it into a longer board that's 3 times as much volume. Your tolerance should be about 3 times as much. And so, we're talking 4 or 5 liters on a bigger board. But when you're ordering a custom board from me, I need your weight, your height, and your age, minimum, and your experience, how long you've surfed and how good you are. Those 5 things. And how good you think you are is relative. But most importantly, how often you get to surf, how long you've been surfing, and how much you weigh, and how old you are, and how tall you are. But when you order a board, trust your shaper. Whether you go to me or you go to somebody else, hopefully you've made the right choice and you have the right reasons for making the choice. Like right now, I'm not going to name names, but I've been going back and forth with a local guy here in La Jolla. He's 30 years old, he's 6'7", and he weighs 240 pounds. And he used to get my son's boards. My son doesn't weigh 240, he's not 6'7", he's 6'4", and he weighs 210, 215. But he says, he used to be able to ride my son's boards, which were 40, 41 liters, and he rode them, but he had a hard time duck diving them. And so he wanted his new board, he wanted to be able to duck dive. And I said, so duck diving is more important than how the board rides? And he's like, I think I should be riding 33, 34 liters. And I go, Wade Carmichael, what's the big guy's name from South Africa? The big top 5 guy.
Jordy Smith.
Jordy. It's probably getting old. Jordy Smith. Those guys, they're not even quite 200 pounds yet, and they ride 32 liters, give or take a bit. So I generally assign maybe 10 pounds to a liter, give or take a little bit. So this guy weighs 45, 50 pounds more than these best surfers in the world, and he wants a board that's 2 liters less. And there's nothing wrong with being tall, it's just a body leverage thing. So I've been going around with him, and I've caved in and I've gone under 40 liters, and we're teasing each other right now, and I'm going, really, the duck diving is more important to you than how the board rides? But the moral of the story is the volume you see on people's websites, their charts, their calculators, is a ballpark thing. It is not gospel. And a lot of times, when I've talked a person into either lower volume or more volume, they go, "Wow, I'm so glad I listened to you." So yeah, the volume thing, I'll probably have a spew about it every week. But trust your shaper. What else? What's the best board for small conditions? Well, if you're talking a short board, I think fish type boards that have more planing area. In other words, they're wider noses, wider in the middle, wider in the tail. They don't necessarily have to have a lot more volume, but the planing area really helps once you're up and above the water and going. I don't think boards with center fins make good small wave boards. Once again, it goes back to the drag thing. So yeah, a lot of the fishes out there are fine. They have lower rocker, so the board gets up and planes in the water quicker, and the extra width helps with that too. and then it comes into proportions. I said time and time again, I'm kind of a balanced guy. I don't like my noses a whole lot wider than my tails, or a whole lot in this, especially on the performance shortboards. I don't like them a whole lot narrower. But and then there's, for small waves, you can get into mid-lengths. They're good. You can turn them still and stuff. And then there's longboards. So I think the basic answer to that is width, extra width, and lower rocker, and not necessarily the volume. If I made 2 5/8 thwarts and they had the same dimensions, except one was a 1/4 inch thicker than the other, chances are you might like the thinner one, just because it still gets out of the water and it planes and everything, but it's more maneuverable. It'll have more flex. The thinner the board is, the more flex it has. So, yeah. Planing area and rocker. What else? I love the crossover for small waves. It's personal preference. I mean, the crossover, was for Josh about 15 years ago, and it has a pretty deep concave in it. But ideally, I think most surfers, you could do with a little less, especially entry rocker, and a little bit more width up front.
How long did you have the music logo for your surfboards in the 70s?
How long did you have the music logo on your surfboards in the 70s? If you'll see my latest Instagram post, I post a beautiful 7/8 music semi-gun I made for a longtime friend. So I started making the boards in April of 74. And 73, 74, it's a long time. But I was still working for GNS at the time, and mainly worked in the summers, and in the winters I'd travel. I'd go to Hawaii and other places. And I was on my first trip to Australia, and I've told this story many times, but I was down there and I go, I had an earlier label called Starlight that I did briefly before GNS. But when I was in Australia, I go, man, I was really into music, and I thought, what a great name for a surfboard label. And I put the exclamation mark on it to, I think every good logo has to have some kind of thing that sets it apart. And so it's got the exclamation mark. But I made my first one in April, 74, I think, maybe. Pretty sure it was 74. I was just 21. But I've been making them ever since. I took a little hiatus when I made Canyons in the late 70s and early 80s. And I made a few ever since I've done Rusty, but I've never really pursued it as a second label. It's mainly just customs. So I'm just about out of time, and I want to wish all of you thank you for tuning in, and stay healthy.